Welcome, my friend. I'm glad to see you could make it. Please enter my study where we may sit in comfort, and I can tell you the tale of the haunting of Ardachie Lodge. Let us journey back in time to December 1952, when Peter McEwen and his wife Dorothy embarked on a new chapter of their lives. Seeking solace from the bustling city of London, the couple relocated to Ardachie Lodge, a sturdy stone structure nestled near the shores of Loch Ness in the breathtaking Scottish Highlands, close to the town of Fort Augustus. Both Peter and Dorothy were qualified psychologists, but Dorothy's fragile health necessitated a move to a rural environment for a chance at improving well-being. Joined by their two young children and Peter's father, who took up residence in a cosy cottage on the lodge's sprawling grounds, the McEwens arrived with a grand vision in mind: to raise pedigree pigs and sheep. The old hunting lodge with its myriad outbuildings stood before them as a beacon of promise and an ideal setting for their aspirations. In the summer of 1953, the family had finally settled themselves enough to hire a housekeeper and a farmhand to lend a hand with the livestock. They decided to advertise the positions in a London newspaper, hoping to attract the right candidates. Little did they know that their advertisement would catch the attention of the McDonalds, a couple in their 40s who were yearning to escape the bustling city and return to their Scottish roots. Despite originally hailing from Edinburgh, they were unfamiliar with the Highlands. Nevertheless, fueled by their determination to start anew beyond the border, they eagerly accepted the job offer without even knowing the identity of the family they would be working for, or the exact location of the house. For Mr. MacDonald, this decision meant severing ties with his previous life as a postman in London. It meant leaving behind not only his job, but also his pension. However, both he and his wife were willing to embrace the unknown and hoped to make a positive impression during their initial month of probation with the McEwens. So, on a weary August the 17th, 1953, Mr. and Mrs. MacDonald finally arrived at Ardachie after a long and exhausting journey up north. As the evening wore on and the clock approached 10:30, the McEwen family had gathered in the cosy sitting room, engrossed in their activities. Suddenly a sense of urgency swept through the air as the MacDonalds entered the room in a flurry. Something seemed amiss. They offered quick apologies for the intrusion, visibly agitated and anxious. The McEwens exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what could be troubling their new employees. Mrs. MacDonald wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. The McEwens, inquired about their still trying to comprehend the situation, seeking confirmation, assured her there was nothing wrong with their accommodation. Curiosity piqued, they listened intently as Mrs. MacDonald began to recount an unsettling experience. It appeared that shortly after retiring to bed, Mrs. MacDonald had been jolted awake by the distinct sound of footsteps echoing up the stairs, creeping along the corridor, and slipping into the room adjacent to theirs. Her husband, oblivious to these nocturnal disturbances, had slept soundly through it all. Filled with trepidation, she had ventured out into the corridor, only to find it devoid of any presence. Yet, as if mocking her, the footsteps had returned, compelling her to wake her slumbering husband. Together they had listened with bated breath as the slow, rhythmic footsteps moved across the corridor and entered the room just across from theirs. But upon investigation, the room lay empty, devoid of any living soul. The McEwens, keen to allay their fears, offered a logical explanation. They pointed out that the house was old, its weathered bones prone to creaks and groans as night settled in. However, the MacDonalds remained unconvinced, dismissing the notion that mere settling sounds could be responsible for what they had experienced. The frightened housekeeper, firmly believing she had heard the footsteps of a human, was certain that something out of the ordinary was afoot, and with a lingering sense of unease, the MacDonalds retreated to their room, seeking solace in the hope that the disturbances would subside. But an hour later, their peace was shattered once again as the MacDonalds complained of persistent knocking sounds resonating from the very walls that enclosed them. The room reverberated with 3 or 4 consecutive thumps echoing in the silence. Fueled by fear, Mr. MacDonald quickly flicked on the light switch, only to witness an abrupt cessation of the haunting noises. The entire household was now on edge, the once peaceful atmosphere punctured by an unexplained disturbance. Whispers of the supernatural began to circulate, filling the air with a mix of curiosity and dread. What unseen forces lurked within the walls of the old house? As the night wore on, the mystery deepened, leaving the residents anxiously contemplating what the following hours would bring. Both couples agreed to retreat to the kitchen downstairs to deliberate on the situation at hand. Peter McEwen suggested that the 2 men venture back to the bedroom, where they settled in darkness for 10 long minutes, straining their ears for any sign of disturbance, but to no avail. Surprisingly, despite the lack of evidence, Mrs. MacDonald adamantly refused to spend the night in that room. Consequently, she and her husband were relocated to a distant guest bedroom, which involved traversing 2 flights of stairs and another corridor. As soon as Mrs. MacDonald stepped into the new room, she instinctively made her way towards a far wall and pressed her head against the fireplace, as if attempting to listen intently. Then, in a startling turn of events, she suddenly froze in a state of shock, her gaze fixed upon a corner of the room, leaving the 3 observers dumbfounded. Dorothy McEwen implored her to desist, for her behaviour was unsettling them, but Mrs. MacDonald seemed entirely oblivious and continued to cast fearful glances across the room. Without warning, she raised her arm and began beckoning an invisible presence towards her. After a few moments, a visibly distressed Mrs. MacDonald appeared to awaken from her trance-like state. She surveyed the room, an expression of bewilderment etched upon her face, and questioned the others if they too had witnessed the presence of an old woman with a cap on her head and a shawl draped across her shoulders. This apparition, with unkempt grey hair, had gestured for Mrs. MacDonald to follow her. As she recounted her harrowing experience, Mrs. MacDonald recounted hearing the flapping of wings and feeling a draining of her strength. It became clear that Mrs. MacDonald couldn't possibly sleep in a room where she claimed to have seen the ghostly figure. The frustrated McEwens came up with a suggestion. They offered the MacDonalds a vacant bedroom across from theirs, far away from the previous disturbing incidents in the house. To provide comfort, both doors would be kept open and the lights turned on. This arrangement was meant to reassure Mrs. MacDonald. However, just 10 minutes into settling into the new room, the MacDonalds heard faint tapping sounds once again. Disturbed by the recurring disturbances, Dorothy McEwen and Mrs. MacDonald's husband were awakened from their sleep for a 3rd time. All 4 individuals gathered on the landing at the top of the main staircase. They stood there for a few moments discussing the events of the night, when suddenly Mrs. MacDonald froze in terror. She peered towards the end of the landing and exclaimed, "There she is again! Can't you see her? She is crawling towards us on her hands and knees, holding a candle." None of the others could perceive the figure, yet Mrs. MacDonald insisted it was there. Peter McEwen, trying to make sense of the situation, encouraged his new housekeeper to communicate with the apparition, softly murmuring, "What is troubling you?" Unfortunately, Mrs. MacDonald was unable to continue speaking. The ghostly figure moved away, disappearing around a corner of the landing, before returning, struggling to crawl towards a frightened housekeeper. The fear intensifying, the group quickly guided Mrs. MacDonald downstairs, seeking refuge in the kitchen. At this point, the entire household was gripped by fear, leading them to make the decision to abandon the lodge for the rest of the night and take shelter in Peter McEwen's father's nearby cottage. The next day dawned, and Peter McEwen embarked upon a visit to his neighbour, Mrs. Beckett of Kalaki House. He sought Mrs. Beckett's wisdom, hoping she could unveil the intriguing history of his own abode, Ardachie. Ardachie, a magnificent shooting lodge, had its origins in the year 1840. It was Charles Gillespie, a prominent landowner, who first envisioned this architectural marvel in the enchanting style of the Georgian era. What made Ardachie even more remarkable was its integration of elements from previous farm structures that once stood on the same grounds. The echoes of lively shooting parties held within Ardachie's walls during specific months of the year remained etched in the memories of the neighbouring residents. As time passed, ownership of the estate transitioned from Charles Gillespie to Colonel Campbell in the interwar years. The Colonel, too, eventually departed from this world, leaving Ardachie to be inherited by the Bruen family. The Bruens, who had previously owned properties in Ireland, now took residence in this distinguished lodge. Within Ardachie lived the elderly Mrs Bruen and her sister, both revered and cherished by the local community. Eager to paint a vivid picture of the old lady, Peter McEwen inquired about her appearance from Mrs Beckett. In response, Mrs Beckett described Mrs Bruen wearing a shawl and a small cap, her hair grey and unkempt. Curiosity sparked within McEwen as he wondered if Mrs Bruen had breathed her last breath within the very walls that surrounded them. The answer, however, was negative. Although Mrs Bruen had resided in Ardachie until a few months prior to her passing, her frail health eventually led to her admission to a nursing home in Inverness. It became evident that Mrs Bruen had suffered from a severe form of arthritis and had also experienced the debilitating effects of a stroke, which greatly impaired her mobility during her final months. With each revelation, the enigmatic history of Ardachie continued to unfold, leaving Peter McEwen yearning to delve deeper into the secrets and stories that lay hidden within its venerable walls. Intriguingly, the elderly lady possessed a most peculiar inclination that captured one's curiosity. During the nighttime hours, she would surreptitiously traverse the entire house, manoeuvring on all fours with an unyielding grip on a solitary candle. In this eerie manner, she vigilantly safeguarded her household staff, harbouring suspicions of their involvement in theft. This revelation left Peter McEwen utterly confounded. Could it be conceivable that their own housekeeper had indeed borne witness to the spectral manifestation of Mrs Bruen, ceaselessly crawling through the premises? Furthermore, why was it solely Mrs MacDonald who possessed the uncanny ability to perceive this ethereal phantom? That eventful evening, the MacDonalds reached a decisive conclusion to retreat to the modest confines of their downstairs kitchen for slumber. With the clock hands pointing to an early hour, around 9:30, they settled themselves in bed. As Mr MacDonald succumbed to sleep, his wife awoke abruptly, recalling her oversight in retrieving the milk, a customary task as a local shepherd faithfully left it outside the back door each evening. Thus she ventured towards the kitchen door, only to find herself confronted by a cascade of peculiar sounds resonating through the room, a symphony of knocks and taps that reverberated mysteriously. Mrs MacDonald hesitated momentarily, her heart pounding, but eventually summoned the courage to unlatch the door. To her profound horror, a chilling sight materialized before her very eyes. An aged woman positioned on all fours at the foot of the stairs. Intently she peered at the apparition, yet discerning any distinct features proved futile. The phantom presence, existing on the fringe of humanity, commenced its gradual crawl towards her. Overwhelmed by an all-consuming terror, Mrs MacDonald instinctively recoiled, hastily retreating into the kitchen and forcefully slamming the door shut. In the face of sheer terror, the McEwens were compelled to once again flee their house for the night, not willing to face the inexplicable occurrences alone. Taking their children and seeking refuge with the MacDonalds, they decided it was high time to seek expert guidance in order to make sense of the strange events plaguing both families. Peter McEwen, a long-standing member of the Society for Psychical Research, reached out to local members in the hope of finding answers. A few days later, 2 members of the SPR, Mr Ross and Mr Matheson, arrived at Ardachie ready to delve into the enigmatic incidents. As night fell, the entire household congregated in the modest kitchen of the McDonalds, doubling as their sleeping quarters, preparing for a night of vigilance. The room was bathed in a dim, soft glow emanating from the open kitchen range, casting eerie shadows across the space. Mr. MacDonald and Mr. Ross claimed one of the beds, while Mr. Matheson settled into the other, leaving Mrs. MacDonald perched on an armchair between them. The McEwens positioned themselves near the open door, bracing themselves for what lay ahead. A heavy silence enveloped the room, shrouding everyone in a veil of anticipation. Before long, the stillness was broken by a peculiar sound reverberating from the wall near the window. Taps echoed through the air, each strike resembling the striking of wood in a rhythmic pattern of 3, with brief pauses in between. The observer's senses were keenly attuned to this enigmatic symphony, yet, as if in sync with the inexplicable noises, deep sighs began to emanate from Mrs. MacDonald, adding an unsettling layer to the mysterious atmosphere that enveloped the room. As the curious onlookers fixated their gaze, the housekeeper's transformation was nothing short of captivating. Her once limber arms stiffened, hanging resolutely by her side, while her vacant stare became fixated on the open door. Abruptly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, causing her to recoil in fear. Hastily, the main lights flickered on, illuminating the room and restoring Mrs. MacDonald's composure. With an air of uncertainty, she relayed her eerie encounter to the others, claiming to have undeniably witnessed the spectral figure of the old woman entering the room, despite the observers themselves seeing nothing. Recognising the need to grant Mrs. MacDonald time to recover, most of the individuals present decided to leave the room. Upon their return, they found her lying in bed. Once again, the room was enveloped in darkness as they resumed their watch. Within moments, the haunting knocking sounds resurfaced, intertwining with Mrs. MacDonald's heavy breathing. This unsettling symphony continued for several minutes, until the housekeeper finally settled herself and turned to her husband, questioning whether it had all been a dream. Then, with a sombre tone, she uttered, "The rose tree has been neglected. Someone has removed the rose tree." Her words hung in the air, followed by an eerie silence. However, as she reclined on the bed, the knocking noises resumed their torment. Mr. Matheson began to suspect that the housekeeper herself might be orchestrating the enigmatic sounds. Swiftly he directed his flashlight towards Mrs. MacDonald, yet none of the witnesses could discern any movement from her hands. Nevertheless, the distress etched across her face prompted the unanimous decision to conclude the vigil. Everyone retreated to their respective rooms, seeking solace from the uncanny events. The 2 researchers had been assigned the very room where the ghostly apparition had first materialized, yet their night unfolded without a single disturbance. Although an air of tranquility descended upon the house during the early morning hours, the MacDonalds would later insist that the knocking noises persisted until the hour of 5 o'clock. The next day the investigators departed, their expressions clearly revealing their disappointment with what they had witnessed. This left the McEwens with a profound sense of uncertainty, as more questions plagued their minds than answers provided. Among the enigmatic occurrences, one particular detail captured Peter McEwen's attention: the peculiar mention of a missing rose tree by Mrs. MacDonald while she was in a trance-like state. Upon arriving at Ardachie, Peter and his wife had instructed the part-time gardener to clean out an old greenhouse in the garden, intending to repurpose it for growing tomatoes. The greenhouse contained only a peach tree and a large ancient rose tree. Although the rose tree had been relocated outside, it had unfortunately withered away, unbeknownst to Mrs. MacDonald. Peter also recalled a moment during the MacDonald's induction to the grounds of Ardachie when Mrs. MacDonald seemed visibly distressed and uneasy as they entered the rose garden. Peter McEwen's neighbour, Mrs. Beckett, had previously informed him that the former owner of Ardachie, Mrs. Bruen, possessed a deep affection for the rose garden, particularly a rare early flowering rose tree. Reluctantly, McEwen refrained from disclosing to Mrs. Beckett that the cherished tree has met its demise when the gardener cleaned out the greenhouse. Gradually, Peter McEwen began to suspect a connection between the disturbances at Ardachie Lodge and the destruction of Mrs. Bruen's beloved tree. However, as this notion entertained his thoughts, it also seemed utterly absurd. Nevertheless, perplexing events persisted, defying rational explanation. How could Mrs. MacDonald accurately identify Mrs. Bruen's appearance and knowledge of the rose tree? It seemed highly unlikely that the MacDonalds would have acquired this information about the previous owner's fondness for roses and the garden from other staff members at the lodge. Only two individuals, Nanny Jenny McLean and gardener David Coates, both present on the day the MacDonalds assumed their roles, had known Mrs. Bruen during her lifetime. Could it be possible that Mrs. MacDonald was fabricating the haunting and producing the knocking sounds herself? After all, she was the sole witness to the apparition of the elderly woman, and, along with her husband, the first to hear the mysterious knocks and raps. McEwen couldn't help but find it foolish to believe that the MacDonalds, who had willingly abandoned their lives in London and were determined to succeed in their new profession, would risk alarming and alienating their employers by declaring their home haunted in such a peculiar manner. On the evening of August the 22nd, Peter and Dorothy McEwen found themselves seated once again alongside the MacDonalds, eagerly awaiting any signs of the supernatural. The familiar knocks echoed through the air, sending shivers down their spines. But this time there was a puzzling twist. The source of the haunting sounds remained elusive, leaving them perplexed and the session inconclusive. At this point, the specifics of the haunting no longer mattered. The McEwen family had reached their breaking point, burdened by the strain that had become unbearable. Concerned for the well-being and safety of his loved ones, Peter made arrangements for his wife and children to escape on a brief holiday, seeking respite from the haunted abode. He also asked the MacDonalds to leave. As the MacDonalds bid their farewell, departing from Ardachie on August 29th, 1953, their once joyful arrival, filled with hope and smiles, was now replaced by tearful goodbyes. The departure of the MacDonalds brought a semblance of tranquillity back to Ardachie. However, the past 2 weeks had taken a toll on Dorothy McEwen, leaving her with an overwhelming urge to escape the house's unsettling presence. Consequently, her husband made the difficult decision to sell the estate. The property was eventually acquired by a successful veterinary surgeon who decided to carry on the farming business. Meanwhile, Major Vernon, the owner of the neighbouring Glendow estate, obtained the lodge as an addition to his property. However, Major Vernon, having no intention to reside in Ardachie, chose to seal up the lodge, rendering it empty and uninhabited. Whether any further instances of paranormal activity plagued the house after the McEwens sold it remains a mystery. Nevertheless, rumours regarding Ardachie Lodge began to circulate among the locals, transforming the once ordinary building into a place with a haunted reputation. Tales emerged claiming that an exorcism had taken place during the MacDonald's stay, a solemn ritual involving candlelit rooms and recitations of Mass, an attempt to rid the premises of the ghostly presence of the old woman. Amidst the disruption of their idyllic Scottish existence, the McEwens became firm believers in the existence of genuine paranormal phenomena at Ardachie. What's intriguing is that Mrs. MacDonald, unbeknownst to herself, possessed psychic abilities that likely acted as a catalyst for these eerie incidents. Regrettably, this enigmatic couple, whose involvement in the realm of psychical research was fleeting at best, left behind no trace of their subsequent lives, nor any indication as whether the former housekeeper encountered any further spine-chilling encounters with the supernatural. It was a desolate winter day in 1968 when an army team descended upon Ardachie Lodge. The house, once forsaken and now encompassed by neglected trees and overgrown rhododendrons, had languished in vacancy for countless years. Lingering rumours perpetuated the notion that the premises were haunted, with the spectre of old Mrs. Bruen perpetually roaming the empty rooms and corridors after nightfall. However, on this cold and biting day, the army personnel sought to bring an end to these tales once and for all. They meticulously positioned dynamite charges around the walls of the house and ignited the detonators. The vacant windows of the desolate lodge gazed out upon the unkempt gardens for a final time. When the dust had settled and the debris was cleared away, every trace of the haunted structure had been erased. By day's end, Ardachie Lodge existed no more, and the peculiar events that had unfolded during those unsettling 12 days in 1953 gradually faded from the collective memory of all who knew them. And so ends my tale of the haunting of Ardachie Lodge. I hope you found it entertaining, and if you did, please subscribe, like, and maybe leave a comment down below. I thank you for your company, my friend, and look forward to sitting with you again very soon.